She judged him before the plane even took off. By the time they landed, the truth about him would shatter every assumption she'd made. The afternoon sun streamed through the massive glass walls of the terminal, drenching the polished floor in golden warmth. The light danced across rolling suitcases and polished shoes, catching on the chrome edges of chairs and the metallic frames of the boarding gates. Outside, planes taxied lazily against a brilliant blue sky, their white fuselages gleaming under the sunlight like sleek birds about to take flight. Inside, the airport was alive with its usual symphony rolling, luggage wheels rattling over tile, faint echoes of children laughing, and the metallic chime of flight announcements cutting through the hum of conversation. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted from a nearby cafe, mingling with the faint tang of disinfectant that clung to every airport in the post-pandemic era. Boarding for Flight 217 had just begun. Passengers lined up, boarding passes in hand, shifting impatiently from one foot to the other. The priority boarding lane was moving first, a slow but steady stream of well-dressed travelers, stepping forward with practiced confidence. Among them stood a woman in her mid-40s, the kind who wore her wealth as naturally as her perfume. Her tailored navy suit was crisp and flawless, accented by a silk scarf knotted perfectly at her throat. A designer handbag hung from her forearm like a quiet announcement of status, its gold clasp catching the sunlight. Her hair honey blonde with careful lowlights was styled into a smooth bob that framed a sharp, angular face. Her lips were painted a muted rose, but her eyes were quick, calculating, always assessing. She stood with her weight on one heel, shoulders squared, scanning the line ahead of her with mild impatience. Her gaze swept over the passengers, pausing momentarily on a tall man a few places ahead. He was in his early 30s, easily over 6 feet, with a lean but strong build. His skin was the deep, rich tone of dark mahogany, and sunlight from the windows seemed to rest on him, lending an almost warm glow to his features. He wore a neatly pressed navy polo shirt and well-fitted jeans, nothing flashy, just clean, simple, and deliberate. His black carry-on was unbranded, worn but well kept, and his sneakers were spotless. Unlike the others in line, he wasn't glancing at his watch or shifting impatiently. Instead, he stood quietly, one hand in his pocket, the other holding his boarding pass loosely. His expression was calm, even serene, as if the chaos of the airport existed in another world entirely. The woman's sharp gaze lingered on him for just a moment too long. Something about him seemed out of place here. First class was, in her mind, a space for executives, old money families, or travelers with miles upon miles of elite status, not someone who dressed like he was heading to a casual lunch. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she adjusted her bag and looked away. An announcement rang out overhead, cheerful but mechanical. Now boarding all first-class passengers for Flight 217 to New York. Please have your boarding passes and identification ready. The line inched forward. The woman stepped ahead with deliberate poise, heels clicking softly against the polished tile. The man moved forward too, his long stride closing the gap between him and the gate. A faint murmur of conversation surrounded them. Two businessmen ahead were discussing quarterly earnings. A young couple nearby whispered excitedly about their upcoming honeymoon. The woman kept her focus straight ahead, but every so often, her eyes flicked toward the tall man again. There was no arrogance in his posture, no restless fidgeting, just a quiet, steady presence, though he had nowhere to rush and nothing to prove. A gate agent scanned the man's boarding pass with a polite smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone warmer than the standard scripted greeting. He smiled back, just a small curve of his lips, but enough to show the depth of dimples on either cheek, and stepped toward the jet bridge. The woman caught the exchange, her brow tightening slightly. "Mr. Carter," she thought. The name rang no bells. She brushed it off, stepping forward for her own turn at the gate. The golden light from the terminal followed them as they made their way toward the plane, shadows stretching long across the floor. The hum of the boarding crowd faded into the muffled quiet of the jet bridge, where the cool scent of recirculated air replaced the warm aromas of the terminal. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin glowed softly in the muted afternoon light, filtering through the oval windows. Plush leather seats stood waiting, wide enough to cradle their passengers in comfort. The man settled into his seat calmly, storing his bag with practiced ease, then flipping open a sleek, leather-bound notebook. The woman, meanwhile, placed her handbag carefully into the overhead bin, her eyes briefly sweeping over him again. She didn't speak, but her mind had already made its silent judgment. And yet, without knowing it, she had just stepped into a flight that would unravel her assumptions, thread by thread. The line for priority boarding had slowed to a crawl, the gate agent pausing to help a passenger who had misplaced his ID. The air was thick with the mingled scents of perfume, coffee, and faint jet fuel drifting in from the tarmac. The woman shifted her weight to her other heel, her sharp eyes wandering again. That was when she noticed him really noticed him. The tall black man stood 2 spots ahead in the same line, boarding pass in hand. He wasn't talking, wasn't trying to make small talk with the people around him. He simply stood there, patient, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the bustle of the terminal. Her eyes narrowed, sweeping over him from head to toe. Jeans, a polo shirt, sneakers immaculately clean, but sneakers nonetheless. Not the attire she associated with first class. She took in the worn edges of his carry-on bag, the absence of any visible brand logos, and the quiet way he held himself. It was the kind of quiet that didn't ask for attention but, somehow, commanded it anyway. Her lips pressed together, the corners twitching upward not in warmth, but in something smaller, sharper. She tilted her chin slightly and let out a breathy sound, a muted, dismissive scoff. It was a noise loaded with meaning, a judgment wrapped in a single exhale. Then, almost without thinking, she leaned on her designer bag, letting its gold clasp glint in the sunlight, and muttered under her breath, just loud enough to slip past. The ambient noise, figures, the word floated in the small pocket of air between them. It wasn't a full sentence, but it didn't need to be. It carried all the weight of her assumptions, the sum total of everything she thought she'd already knew about him. The man's head turned slightly, just enough to catch her in his peripheral vision. For the briefest moment, their eyes met hers, cool, his unreadable, and then, without a word, he gave her the smallest of smiles, not the kind meant to charm or appease, not sarcastic, not mocking, just knowing. It was the sort of smile that said, "I see you, I understand exactly what you think, and it doesn't matter." The moment stretched between them. A faint click of heels from behind broke it, and the line shuffled forward. She turned her gaze away quickly, fixing it on the gate ahead, though her chest felt oddly warm as if she had been caught in some subtle game she hadn't known she was playing. The man didn't look back again. He simply stepped forward, boarding pass in hand, the easy rhythm of his movements suggesting that this was all perfectly ordinary for him. But for her, something had shifted. Her fingers drummed against the leather of her bag as she tried to brush the moment away. Why should I feel awkward, she thought. I was just making an observation. Still, the memory of his quiet smile clung to her, threading through the noise of the terminal. When it was finally his turn at the gate, the agent scanned his ticket with a crisp beep. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter," she said, the warmth in her voice slightly different from the polite neutrality she used with everyone else. That caught the woman's attention again. Mr. Carter. There was a familiarity in the way the agent spoke his name, as if she knew him more, at least knew of him. The man gave a nod of acknowledgement and stepped toward the jet bridge. His stride was unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. The woman's turn came moments later. The gate agent greeted her with the standard, "Welcome aboard," but the voice carried none of the extra weight she had heard before. She told herself she wasn't bothered by it, but a small part of her bristled anyway, as she walked down the jet bridge. The echo of her heels against the metal ramp seemed louder than usual, her thoughts louder still. She had met countless people, in first-class executives, lawyers, politicians, athletes. Many had the same crisp confidence she saw in him, but something about his manner unsettled her. It was too untainted, too unaffected by her presence. By the time she stepped into the first-class cabin, he was already seated, his carry-on stowed neatly in the overhead bin. He had settled in with a leather-bound notebook open on the tray table, a black pen in hand. No headphones, no phone, no nervous fiddling. Just writing. She passed by him without a word, though she was aware of her own posture, how she straightened her shoulders, how her gaze lingered for a split second longer than necessary. Her seat was 2 rows ahead, close enough to occasionally glance back, without it being obvious. As she slid her bag beneath the seat in front of her, she caught herself thinking, what could he possibly have to write about before takeoff? She didn't know it yet, but the next few hours would slowly quietly dismantle everything she thought she understood about him. And it had all begun with that single, almost imperceptible smile. The muted hush of the first-class cabin wrapped around them as they stepped inside, a world apart from the bustling terminal they had just left. Soft, indirect lighting washed over rows of wide leather seats. The air carried a faint, clean fragrance, citrus, part the subtle perfume of fresh upholstery. The man moved first, walking with the same unhurried confidence he had shown in the boarding line. He stowed his modest black carry-on in the overhead compartment with ease, then slid into his seat, third row from the front, on the aisle. The woman entered moments later. Her heels clicked gently against the carpet as she navigated to her own. Seat 2 rose behind him, and on the opposite side of the aisle. She placed her handbag into the bin above her with great care, as though it were more fragile than anything in her suitcase, then sank into her seat with a quiet sigh. She did not look at him, not directly. Instead, her eyes flickered past in the way one glances at a painting they've already decided isn't worth a second look. When a flight attendant approached with a practiced smile, she accepted a glass of champagne without hesitation. The bubbles shimmered in the glass, catching the cabin lights as she raised it to her lips. In her other hand, she unfolded a glossy magazine, the kind with oversized headlines about celebrity feuds and royal scandals. The paper crackled as she smoothed the pages. The man, meanwhile, had settled in with deliberate composure. From the seat pocket, he drew out a slim, leather-bound notebook. The cover was deep brown and well-worn, as though it had been his constant companion for years. He opened it to a blank page and began to write. His pen moved steadily, his handwriting neat and precise, each line slanting uniformly, as though trained by discipline. Occasionally, he paused not in hesitation, but in reflection before continuing. With the same unhurried flow, there was something about the quiet intention in his movements that contrasted sharply with the restless flick of her magazine pages. The woman, sipping her champagne, found her gaze drifting against her will. Out of the corner of her eye, she watched as a flight attendant approached him again, not with the mechanical courtesy she was accustomed to, but with a warmth that bordered on familiarity. "Mr. Carter," the attendant said with a smile that reached her eyes, "it's wonderful to see you again. I hope the children's program is going well." The pictures from last month's event were beautiful. The man's expression softened. He set his pen down and looked up at her. "Thank you, Clara. It's coming along better than we hoped. The kids have been thriving." His voice was calm and steady, the kind that carried without being loud. The woman's eyebrow arched slightly over the rim of her champagne glass. "Children's program." She glanced back at her magazine, pretending disinterest, but her ears strained to catch the rest of the exchange. "We still talk about the speech you gave," Clara continued, leaning slightly toward him. "It really moved everyone." He smiled faintly. "That means a lot. Tell the team I'll be back to visit soon." The attendant nodded and moved on. Leaving the man to return to his notebook, the woman turned a page in her magazine without registering the headline. The glossy print felt heavier than usual in her hands. She told herself it was none of her business, but the seeds of curiosity had been planted tiny and insistent. Another attendant stopped by his seat a few minutes later, this time carrying a small note from someone seated in the rear of the cabin. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter," she said. "The gentleman in 14C wanted to say he's a big admirer of your work. He asked if it would be all right to get your autograph after the flight." The man chuckled softly. "Of course, tell him I'd be happy to." The woman's brow furrowed in the faintest crease. Autograph. Her mind reached for explanations. Actor, musician, perhaps a local sports figure, but none of it fit neatly with the image of the man in the polo shirt, writing quietly in his notebook, with no entourage, no flashy jewelry, no air of showmanship. She forced herself to refocus on the magazine, but the articles seemed hollow now, their drama manufactured and distant. Across the aisle and 2 rows ahead, the man continued to write, occasionally gazing out the window at the sunlit clouds drifting by. The hum of the engines deepened as the plane climbed higher. The woman finished her champagne, set the empty glass down, and tried to lose herself in the shallow glamour of celebrity gossip. Yet each time she turned a page, her eyes betrayed her sliding once again toward the man who sat in quiet contrast to her own restless mind. It was as though an invisible thread had begun to pull between them, taut with unspoken tension. She didn't understand why she kept glancing at him, nor why each interaction he had with the crew seemed to tug at some unacknowledged curiosity. What she did know, though she wouldn't admit it even to herself, was that something about him didn't match the story she had written in her head back in the boarding line, and the flight was only just beginning. The aircraft had settled into the quiet hum of pre-takeoff. Passengers were adjusting seatbelts, flipping through in-flight magazines, and tucking bags under seats. The muted rustle of activity seemed to stretch time, giving the woman just enough space to notice details she would have otherwise ignored. The man sat 2 rows ahead, still half-turned toward the window, his notebook open on the tray table. Sunlight spilled across the page, catching the fine edges of his handwriting. His pen moved deliberately, no wasted strokes, no hesitation, as though every word was meant to matter. A flight attendant appeared beside him, leaning slightly toward his seat. Her voice was low, but the cabin's stillness carried it just far enough for the woman to hear. "Mr. Carter," she said warmly, "I wanted to thank you again for last month's generous donation to the children's program. The new library wing is already under construction because of you." The man's smile was quiet, unassuming. "I'm glad to hear that," he replied. "The kids deserve every opportunity we can give them." The woman's eyes flicked up from her magazine, her attention caught despite herself. She tilted her head slightly, as though angling for a better listen. "Children's program." The words hung in her mind, attaching themselves to the faint memory of the attendant greeting him at the gate with unusual warmth. Before she could think on it longer, the attendant handed him a small envelope, likely a receipt or note of thanks, and moved on. The man returned to his writing without looking around, as though this sort of interaction was routine for him. The woman shifted in her seat, telling herself it was nothing. Wealthy people made donations all the time. It didn't mean anything about who he was still. There was something in the way he'd responded. No hint of self-congratulation, no need to elaborate or advertise the act. She knew people who donated far less and still made sure the world knew. She opened her magazine again, flipping to a spread about an actress's scandalous divorce. But the words blurred at the edges. The page felt heavier than it should. The glossy paper cooled against her fingertips. The engines began to hum louder, the subtle vibration of power building as the plane prepared to taxi. Cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the transition from idle to motion. A soft announcement from the captain played overhead, his voice calm and practiced. Then, just as the woman lowered her gaze back to the magazine, she noticed movement from the corner of her eye. Another passenger, a man in his 40s wearing a baseball cap, had walked up from the economy section. He leaned slightly over the tall man's seat, speaking in a low voice. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter, I don't mean to bother you before we take off, but I just wanted to say I'm a huge admirer of your work." He glanced down, almost sheepishly. "If it's not too much trouble, could I maybe get your autograph later? My son would never forgive me if I didn't ask." The tall man looked up with a warm, easy smile. "Of course," he said without hesitation. "I'd be happy to." The exchange lasted only a moment before the man from economy returned to his seat, leaving the woman frozen mid-page. Her thoughts clicked quickly, trying to slot these clues into a coherent picture. Generous donations, recognition from strangers, autographs. Her lips pressed together. Probably some minor sports player, she decided. It would make sense to all fit, composed in public. Or maybe a local celebrity, the kind known regionally but not quite famous enough to be recognized everywhere. Someone whose fame lingered just below the surface of mainstream. She told herself this explanation was satisfactory. It fit neatly with the assumptions she had made at the gate. Yet, somewhere in the back of her mind, doubt had begun to tap softly at the door. There was a steadiness to him that didn't quite fit the profile of a sports figure she had in mind. No brashness, no need to perform. Even the autograph request hadn't flustered him. It was accepted with the same composure as a weather report. The plane began to taxi down the runway. The low rumble grew into a powerful roar, and soon the cabin tilted slightly as they gained speed. Her champagne glass rattled softly on the tray table until she steadied it with a manicured hand. Through it all, she stole glances toward the man 2 rows ahead. He sat with his seat upright, notebook closed now, one hand resting lightly on the cover. His gaze was fixed on the window, watching the blur of asphalt give way to sky. She realized, with an odd flicker of irritation, that he hadn't once glanced back at her since they boarded. Not when she scoffed, Not when she had all but stared at him during the attendant's conversation. It was as if her opinion, her silent evaluation, meant nothing to him. The thought lingered as the nose of the plane lifted and the cabin pressed gently into their seats. The woman returned her gaze to her magazine, forcing herself to focus on the trivial gossip in front of her. Still, the details she had overheard clung stubbornly to her mind, refusing to dissolve into irrelevance. She had no idea that each of these clues was the faint outline of a picture, far larger than she could yet imagine, and by the time the final piece fell into place, the picture would be impossible to ignore. The flight had settled into its mid-air rhythm, steady engine hum, the occasional chime from the crew, and the soft shuffle of passengers adjusting blankets or reclining seats. Outside the window, the clouds formed a thick white sea beneath them, the sun casting a warm glow that bathed the cabin in gentle light. The woman had just refilled her champagne glass from the bottle offered by the attendant, the bubbles fizzing delicately. Her magazine lay open on her lap, though she wasn't really reading it anymore. Her mind kept wandering to the overheard conversation about donations, the autograph request, and the man 2 rows ahead. The seatbelt sign was off, and the cabin felt calm, even a little drowsy. But then, without warning, the plane shuddered. It wasn't a violent jolt, just a sudden, sharp dip, followed by a few seconds of uneven bouncing. A ripple of startled gasps moved through the passengers. Her champagne sloshed dangerously close to the rim, and before she could steady it, a golden splash spilled onto her lap and over the edge of the tray table. She exhaled sharply, irritation flashing across her face as she reached for the napkin by her glass, but it was too small to handle the mess, and the bubbles were already soaking into the fabric of her skirt. Before she could ring for a flight attendant, a hand appeared in her peripheral vision. A fresh, folded napkin, larger and thicker than the one she held, was offered over the aisle. She turned her head. The tall man was leaning slightly toward her, his elbow resting lightly on his own armrest. That same calm expression was on his face, and a polite, almost knowing smile played at the corner of his mouth. "You might need a bit more than what they gave you," he said, his tone warm but understated. For a moment, she simply stared. Then, reluctantly, she accepted it. "Thank you," she said, the words clipped but civil. "No trouble at all," he replied, leaning back into his seat. She dabbed at the champagne, careful not to smear it further into the fabric. A few moments passed before she found herself speaking again, the impulse surprising her. "I wasn't expecting turbulence. The forecast said it was going to be smooth the whole way." He glanced up from the notebook on his tray. "That's the thing about turbulence," he said with a faint smile. "It doesn't care much for forecasts." She allowed the corner of her lips to twitch just slightly. "I suppose that's true." He closed the notebook and rested his pen on top of it. His posture was relaxed, but his gaze was attentive, as though she had his full focus despite the simplicity of the exchange. "You travel often?" he asked. "Often enough," she replied, taking another small sip of champagne as if reclaiming her composure. "Mostly for business." He nodded slowly. "It has its rhythm after a while. Airports, boarding lines, layovers. Feels like a second home. You too, I assume." He shrugged lightly, his smile never quite leaving. "I'm on the move, a fair amount, different places, different reasons." It was an answer that said much and nothing at all. She noticed that how easily he could give a reply that invited no further probing yet didn't feel evasive. She tilted her head slightly. "And you keep notes along the way?" She nodded toward his notebook. "Sometimes," he said, glancing at it briefly before looking back at her. "Ideas, reminders, things I don't want to lose in the noise of travel." There was no hint of boasting in his tone, no urge to elaborate on what those ideas might be. The conversation felt strangely steady. She was used to men either trying to impress her or rushing to fill silences with small talk. But he left space room for pauses, for thought, and though she wouldn't admit it, she felt a subtle shift. The image she'd formed of him, one she'd built so confidently back in the boarding line, was beginning to lose shape. Still, she told herself, this didn't mean much. People could be polite without being extraordinary. The napkin was just a small kindness. The conversation was just a way to pass time until the next round of drinks. Yet, as she smoothed the fabric of her skirt, she caught herself watching him again, noticing the way he held himself comfortable without being lazy, engaged without being overbearing. His voice, she realized, carried a certain weight, Not the loud, performative kind, but the kind that lingered quietly, as though it didn't need to prove anything. He asked nothing more of her, didn't press for her name or her profession, and she found herself almost disappointed when the attendant returned with another glass of champagne, breaking the short thread of conversation between them. He smiled politely as she accepted the drink, then returned to his notebook, the pen, moving in steady strokes once again. For the rest of that hour, she read without absorbing a word. Something about that small exchange, that simple act of handing her a napkin, kept replaying in her mind. It wasn't the action itself, it was the effortless way he had done it. No hesitation, no awkwardness, just a quiet generosity that seemed as natural to him as breathing. She didn't know it yet, but the napkin was just the first in a series of small, deliberate acts that would dismantle her assumptions one by one. And before this flight ended, she would realize just how wrong she had been. The landing was smooth, the kind that barely stirred the cabin. A faint thud marked the wheels meeting the runway, followed by the long, steady deceleration that tilted everyone gently forward in their seats. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and an almost collective exhale passed through the passengers. Another journey complete, the woman gathered her belongings with her usual precision, tucking her magazine into her tote and adjusting her scarf. The tall man, 2 rows ahead, closed his notebook and slipped it into his carry-on, moving without hurry, as though the clock bowed to his pace. Disembarking was the same slow shuffle it always was. First class first, then the rest. She stepped onto the jet bridge, the air cooler and faintly metallic compared to the pressurized warmth of the cabin. The low hum of airport life grew louder with every step until they emerged into the terminal, where voices and footsteps filled the space. Like an overlapping orchestra, baggage claim was on the lower level. She took the escalator down, the bright mid-afternoon sun spilling through high windows and glinting off the polished tiles. Passengers clustered around the carousel, the rotating belt already clunking to life with the first wave of suitcases. She glanced around for her own luggage, spotting nothing yet, and decided to pass the time. A small newsstand near the carousel caught her eye, its shelves neat with glossy magazines, gum packets, and overpriced bottled water. Her heels clicked softly as she approached, scanning the familiar collage of covers, smiling celebrities, screaming headlines, and the occasional business journal tucked among them. She reached for a travel magazine, but her hand stopped mid-air. Centered on the top row was Forbes magazine. The glossy cover seemed to leap into focus. A full-page photo of the same man from her flight. No polo shirt, now he was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, and deep blue tie. The background was blurred city skyline, but the sharp clarity of his expression drew the eye. Confident, composed, unmistakable. The headline, in bold white letters, made her chest tighten. The billionaire entrepreneur, changing the face of tech philanthropy. For a heartbeat, she simply stared, her mind scrambling to reconcile the man on the cover with the one she'd quietly dismissed at the boarding gate. The casual clothes, the unbranded luggage, the quiet demeanor, none of it matched the image she now saw, and yet it was him. She read the smaller subheading, How Marcus Carter is Redefining Wealth Through Innovation and Generosity. Her mouth felt suddenly dry, almost on instinct. She turned her head toward the carousel. There he was, standing a few feet away, waiting for his suitcase with the same calm patience he'd had boarding the plane. He was smiling, not the polite smile he'd given her, but a warmer, brighter one as he bent slightly to speak to a boy who couldn't have been more than 12. The boy clutched a phone, beaming as Marcus posed for a quick photo. When the boy's father thanked him, Marcus shook his hand warmly, then returned to his spot by the carousel, unbothered by the stares from a few other passengers who now recognized him. The woman felt something shift deep in her chest, a mix of discomfort, regret, and an uneasy awareness of her own earlier thoughts. She had written a story in her mind about him the moment she saw him, a story based on clothes, posture, and the color of his skin, and that story had been wrong in every possible way. Marcus caught her watching. Their eyes met across the noise and movement of the baggage area. It wasn't a long look, just a second or two, but it was enough. His expression didn't change. There was no smugness, no flash of triumph, just that same steady, unreadable calm he had carried the entire flight. She was the one who looked away. Her suitcase appeared then, sliding onto the belt, as though on cue. She stepped forward to claim it, her fingers tightening around the handle. The smooth leather felt cool against her skin, grounding her in the present moment, though her thoughts were still tangled in what she had just learned. That as she wheeled it toward the exit, she caught one last glimpse of him in the corner of her vision. Marcus Carter, billionaire, philanthropist, and the man she had underestimated without a second thought. And in that moment, a single line surfaced in her mind, uninvited but clear. True worth isn't always visible, and the most extraordinary people often carry it quietly. The carousel's low mechanical hum faded into the background as she rolled her suitcase toward the sliding glass doors. Outside, the afternoon sun hung low, its golden light spilling across the pavement and painting the arriving cars in a warm glow. The air beyond the automatic doors looked bright, almost blinding, but inside the terminal, shadows stretched long across the polished tiles. She moved at a measured pace, her heels making soft, deliberate clicks against the floor, but her mind was far from steady. Every step seemed to echo with the image of that glossy Forbes cover, the headline etched into her thoughts like it had been burned there. The billionaire entrepreneur changing the face of tech, philanthropy. She could still see him, Marcus Carter, standing by the carousel, smiling patiently as strangers approached him. No arrogance, no impatience, just quiet, unwavering presence. The same presence he'd had in the boarding line, on the plane. Even when she'd looked at him with eyes full of assumptions, she remembered the way she had judged him at first glance. The way her lips had curled into a dismissive scoff, the way she had muttered figures under her breath as though she already knew who he was. She hadn't known, not at all. The knowledge pressed against her chest now, heavier than her suitcase handle, because it wasn't just about him being wealthy. It wasn't even about him being on the cover of a magazine. It was about how easily she had decided his place in the world before she had heard a single word from his mouth. She reached the doors, and they parted with a soft hiss, letting in the scent of warm asphalt and faint exhaust from idling taxis. Somewhere behind her, the carousel belt clanked to a stop. A child's laugh echoed briefly, followed by the deep murmur of Marcus's voice. She didn't turn around. The cool handle of her suitcase dug into her palm as she stepped outside. The sun was warm against her face, but the air carried the sharp edge of city noise horns in the distance, the rhythmic rush of cars on the road, and over it all, her thoughts kept circling back to a single, unavoidable truth. The narrator's voice, clear and steady, as if speaking from somewhere deeper than sound, seemed to rise in her mind. True wealth isn't always worn on the outside. Sometimes, the most extraordinary people are the ones we underestimate. She could feel the truth of it in her bones now. Wealth wasn't the price tag on a suit or the brand on a bag. It wasn't the glint of a watch or the seat in first class. Wealth was the quiet power to move the world forward without needing the world's applause. She thought of the way Marcus had written in his notebook, each word placed with intention. She thought of the warmth in his voice when speaking about the children's program. She thought of the easy way he had handed her that napkin, without a flicker of condescension or self-satisfaction, just an uncalculated kindness that had struck her. That she hadn't seen him check his phone once during the flight. He hadn't needed distraction, noise, or validation. He had been entirely present, first with his thoughts, then with the people around him. That kind of presence, she realized, was rare, precious. She reached the taxi stand, the line moving slowly forward. A black sedan pulled up, the driver stepping out to load another passenger's bags. She stood there, the warm wind catching her scarf, and found herself glancing back toward the terminal one last time. Through the wide glass, she saw him, Marcus Carter, his suitcase now in hand, his other hand extended in farewell to the boy who had approached him earlier. He smiled, said something that made the boy's face light up, then turned and began walking toward the exit on the opposite side. There was no rush in his steps, no need to command the space, but somehow he still did. She looked away, not out of shame this time, but with a small, private acknowledgement, a silent promise to herself that she would carry this moment forward. The taxi line moved, and she stepped up, sliding into the cool, leather interior when her turn came. The city stretched out ahead, the streets glowing with the last hours of sunlight. As the car pulled away, she let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the lesson settle fully into place. People were not always who they seemed to be at first glance. Appearances were the flimsiest of measures, and assumptions, those quick, quiet judgments, were traps laid by our own pride. True wealth, she understood now, had nothing to do with what was worn or shown. It was in what was built, given, and carried within him, and sometimes the people who held the most of it were the ones we were most likely to overlook. The city skyline began to rise in the distance, sharp against the burnished sky. Somewhere out there, Marcus Carter would continue doing what he had always done, changing lives, quietly, without the need for recognition, and she would continue her own journey. Changed in a way she hadn't expected when the flight began. Changed because of a stranger in a polo shirt, a leather notebook, and a smile that had asked for nothing in return. The car turned onto the main road, the hum of tires on asphalt, steady and rhythmic. She settled back in her seat, the words still echoing in her mind. True wealth isn't always worn on the outside. Sometimes, the most extraordinary people are the ones we underestimate. This time, she knew she would never forget them.